Hello. This is chapter 3. Chapter 1 covers the sort of pre-Columbian era. Chapter 2 covers how the colonies came about, who started colonizing, when they started colonizing, and even a little bit as to why they started colonizing. Chapter 3 focuses in a lot more directly on the British colonies, although we do talk a little bit about what was happening in the Spanish and French colonies in North America. But it also discusses a little bit more in depth the sort of personalities of the early colonies, as well as each set of them had kind of something different going on. And so that's what this chapter is about. And without any further ado, we will dive right in. So, in the Chesapeake consisted of Maryland and Virginia. These are really the first English colonies to prosper because of tobacco, which is what their sort of cash flow what consisted of. Tobacco experienced a bit of a boom in the 1620s, and so there was the big moneymaker. As such, both of these had very similar economies, similar populations, and very similar patterns of growth. In Virginia, there was a state church. Royal support did not necessarily equal financial support in Virginia. And however, as a royal colony, they did have a crown-appointed governor who also appointed an advisory council from the leading planters in the colony. Kind of let the elected assembly slide, but Charles I reinstituted it in order to secure tobacco revenues as he was being threatened with civil war at home. They adopted an English court-style system, with the JPs being the judges, sheriffs being the administrators in the colony of Virginia. And they also established the Anglican Church as the official church of the colony. And taxpayers were legally obligated to pay taxes to the Anglican Church. The vestries were administered with the funds and were elected. The church sort of ministers were elected until 1662, when the assembly made them sort of self-perpetuating, meaning that they would choose their own successor. The priest only trained in England, and so a lot of them were able to find pulpits there, and very few were attracted to the colonies. So actually, ministers were somewhat few and far between in the colonies. So when services were held, attendance at them was mandatory. In Virginia, you have a bit of a different situation. The Crown granted large tracts of land to Lord Baltimore, who intended to create a refuge for English Catholics there. However, Protestants ended up forming the majority of the population pretty much from the outset. The grant guaranteed freedom from royal taxation and the ability to appoint sheriffs and judges, and the privilege to create a local nobility in Maryland, which was something Baltimore was interested in, but could never quite get off the ground. He introduced, however, a manor sort of system where you would have an estate with a lord who could maintain private law courts, employ a Catholic priest as the personal chaplain, and keep antagonism down. But it didn't work out so well. They ended up adopting a headright system, offering a 2,000-acre manor to anyone who could transport 5 adults. That was eventually increased to 20 adults later, which is kind of a steep price, actually, even for 2,000 acres. And so it didn't quite work out as planned. In 1675, Maryland's 60 non-proprietary manors had evolved into plantations, much like you would see in Virginia. Religious antagonism was prominent in Maryland. Even though there was a Protestant majority, you still had Baltimore and his descendants as Catholics. And so you see the passage of an act for religious toleration passed in Maryland, which Baltimore agreed to in order to protect his Catholic minority, and the Protestant majority elected assembly agreed to in order to protect the Protestant majority from Baltimore. and his Catholics. So it didn't really have much as far as toleration as we would now think of it. It was really just a measure to kind of keep peace between the Catholics and Protestants in Maryland. It didn't, however, protect non-Christians and threatened some pretty serious consequences should you go around denying the divinity of Jesus Christ. So, not actually all that tolerant by today's standards. It did, however, also fail to keep the peace between the Catholics and Protestants and was eventually repealed in 1654. In both of these colonies, tobacco sustained the demand for labor and lured over 100,000 English to the two colonies between 1630 and 1700. About 90% of those that came over were indentured servants, and about 80% of those that came over were also male. The shortage of women meant that brides were few and far between. Servants were banned from marriage until their indenture was complete, and so even then, the 80% of people that were coming over were sort of off limits for at least a good 5 years or so until their indenture was finished. Not that that stopped anyone in particularly. You just had to be a bit more careful about it, apparently. The women that did come got to sort of the pick of the litter, essentially, as far as husbands go, and could often make very advantageous marriages as a result of the scarcity of women. High death rates were still a problem and tended to characterize this region even later as we moved past the sort of Jamestown period. Life expectancy for men was about 48. For women, it was about 44, which was nearly 20 years lower than colonies in places like New England. This kind of fact of life, or fact of death, I suppose, crippled family life. Half of all married people lost their spouses within 7 years of marriage, and you quite often saw a lot of mixed families with children from other marriages being brought in by either fathers or mother, and sometimes you would even see children from several different marriages brought into one family. And so it made for an interesting dynamic. Widows often enjoyed greater economic power in the Chesapeake, as she was very frequently left the entire estate to do with as she wanted upon her husband's death. The combination of the high death rate and the predominantly male population also meant very limited population growth, meaning that even though you have well over 100,000 immigrants by 1700 coming in, the population in the Chesapeake colonies is only about 70,000 because everybody sort of dies off rather quickly. Tobacco pretty much dominated the economies of Maryland and Virginia. It grew best on level ground with good drainage, so it was usually next to rivers. Individual planters basically controlled the commerce and so tended to stunt the growth of towns in the region. Although the prices fell dramatically in 1629, it remained profitable as long as it could be sold at more than 2 pence per pound, which usually meant lower transportation costs. However, small planters tended to struggle, and so it really became a kind of weeding out mechanism for those who could hack it. Large planters took advantage of the headright system and managed to build up huge holdings and profit from the labor. If someone came over as an indentured servant, they still got a headright, but usually had to give up their headright to the person who paid their passage. And so that person would be able to add to their land holdings without actually having to buy it. Life was fairly hard for the servants. Most were poorly fed, clothed, and housed, and often their indenture was extended for very minor infractions. After 1660, servants were increasingly able, however, to live long enough in order to complete their indenture, but often entered into freedom impoverished. Virginia obliged masters to provide an outfit, which included clothing, a year's supply of corn, and Maryland even included things like tools and another 50-acre claim. However, the good land had already been claimed by the planters brought them over, so they were often left with not so good land to claim for themselves. Many that actually obtained land and their freedom still remained impoverished. By 1670, many of these freed indentured servants had concluded that they needed access to better land in order to prosper, and so they began to focus on the nearby Native American tribes. Resentful planters also tended to get into fights with local Native coalitions, and against the orders of the governor, shot and killed the leader of the coalition. The tribes agreed to remain in a designated area after that. However, tensions flared yet again, not only between the tribes and the planters, but between colonial leaders and the smaller planters. Governor Berkeley and Lord Baltimore both held monopolies on the fur trade, which required friendly relations with the native tribes. And anytime the planters got entangled with the tribes, it threatened those relations, and so threatened the economic prosperity of Governor Berkeley and Lord Baltimore. In June of 1675, a dispute between a native tribe and a Virginia farmer escalated to the massacre of 14 friendly natives who were actually from a completely different tribe to the one that they got into a dispute with. And that followed the assassination of their leader that led to, rather, the assassination of their leader during a peace conference. In Virginia, Berkeley proposed a chain of forts to be built to protect panicked frontiersmen, but they preferred the cheaper option of just waging war and killing all of the natives rather than protection. 300 colonists elected Nathaniel Bacon as their leader, and so took it upon themselves to wage war on mostly peaceful tribes, so not actually the ones that they're having problems with. These rebels demanded the legal authority to wage their war against all natives, which Berkeley granted, being thoroughly intimidated by the group. He did have some second thoughts, however, and called the men back, and they returned, but they weren't happy about it, and ended up forcing the governor to flee the capital. Very soon after that, Bacon died of dysentery, and the rebellion broke up without their leader. A royal commission was determined that Berkeley had mismanaged the crisis thoroughly, and in 1677, it was sort of intended to officially expose. The rebellion, however, did reveal that the society itself was under a fair amount of stress. Land hunger was one motive, but there was also a fair amount of racial hostility against the Native Americans, and there were some who worried about class hostility as well, that these small planters and farmers weren't just angry at the Native Americans, but they were somehow angry at the larger planters as well. And so this makes the larger planters a little bit wary, and they start thinking, well, maybe it would be better if we had a laboring class which remained a laboring class, and rather than earning their freedom at some point to challenge us later. And so early planters began substituting white indentured servants for black slaves sort of shortly after that period. Racial slavery developed in 3 stages in the sort of Chesapeake colonies. From 1619 to about 1640 or so, the colonists distinguished between blacks and whites in official documents, but did not make the assumption that every African sold was a slave for life, and some managed to gain their freedom after a period during that time. After 1640 to about 1660 or so, growing numbers were treated as slaves for life, and their children were also now inheriting that status of slave. White and black laborers on their own very frequently cooperated as equals, and at the same time, some even married. After that, probably in reaction to that, The colonies began legally distinguishing and consigning Africans officially to the status of slave. By 1705, you have very strict legal codes that were defined that placed slaves in society and set a very strict standard of etiquette for them. And so, as you move forward, it gets much more strict as to exactly what the position and the expectation of a slave is. By formally codifying slavery, planter elites attempted to stabilize their society by diffusing the sort of class resentment of fellow whites, the idea of creating a permanent bottom class that everybody could agree is at the bottom, somehow unified those at the top. As slavery expanded, it also began to replace indentured servitude as the principal labor system. Between 1650 and the 1700s, wages rose in England, which meant that the incentive for a lot of poor people to come to the colonies was removed. They had more incentives to stay in England now. And by 1698, the monopoly of exporting slaves was lifted, so more and more slave traders could get into the business, and as a result, more and more slaves began to pour into the Chesapeake. The rise in the direct slave trade exacerbated the growing gap between blacks and whites in America. Prior to 1698, most blacks in the Chesapeake spent a lot of time with Europeans and other Africans, and so were familiar with other cultures, which enabled them to establish some level of understanding with the groups they're coming into contact with. After 1698, though, larger numbers of slaves are pouring in from the interior region of Africa who had next to no experience with the Europeans, with the exception of the boat journey over. They didn't know the language, and so language and other cultural aspects became barriers rather than bridges, and that only served to reinforce sort of racial attitudes against slaves. The changing composition of the white population contributed to the rise of race as a foundation for society. More and more colonists were starting to live long enough in order to marry and have families, so that by 1690 the ratio of men to women was almost equal in the Chesapeake, so you didn't have the same sort of problems anymore in that regard. By 1720, most colonists were native born, and their shared attachment to the colony heightened the sense of a common identity, common racial identity, compared to the rather fragmented and alien black population, which was growing in the Chesapeake area. The next region to prosper after the Chesapeake was the New England region, and Puritanism provided the foundation for New England's regional identity and offered a very sharp contrast to the Chesapeake, which we have just discussed. In New England, James I was more or less tolerant of Puritans in England, and so the number who were coming to New England was still relatively small. However, when Charles I came into power in England, he attempted to eliminate all Puritan influence, which prompted a group of wealthy Puritans to petition for a charter to colonize the Massachusetts Bay. They sent 400 to Salem in 1629, and like in Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay was to be a Puritan-dominated and self-governing colony. By 1630, there were 700 passengers under Governor John Winthrop, who arrived at Boston and called for settlers to establish a city upon a hill, which would be essentially an example for all the rest of the world of their good sort of Puritan style of society and community. Winthrop denounced economic jealousy that bred class resentment, as God deemed some must be rich while others must be poor, and so therefore, if you were one or the other, you just needed to deal with it, as that was obviously your destiny. Clearly, it was much easier for the rich people to deal with than for the poor. In the fall of 1630, you have 6 more towns springing up around Boston. as the numbers coming over are growing, with Charles I being very anti-Puritan. Massachusetts Bay mainly attracted landowning farm families, and was most receptive, at least, to Calvinism. If you weren't Puritan, then the Calvinists were obviously the most welcome. Very few indentured servants came into the Massachusetts Bay Area, and almost no slaves came into the region. The region itself, environmentally, was all around much healthier region to settle in than was the Chesapeake. So you didn't have the sort of period of seasoning that you would get in the Chesapeake region. The death rate was considerably lower. People were able to farm a greater variety of foods, and so their diets are much more varied, and people lived longer, they had more children, that sort of a thing. Political participation in New England and Massachusetts was much broader rather, than anywhere else in Europe or its colonies, as they permitted the voting, or the right to vote, for every adult male saint or church member. 55% of the population could vote, compared to only about 30% in England. In 1634, the General Court agreed to allow each town to send 2 delegates, and in 1644 created a bicameral legislature, where you had elected deputies consisting or making up the lower house, and a governor's council, which made up the upper house. Massachusetts Puritans considered themselves to be spiritual members of the Church of England. They were attempting to rather provide some kind of example for how society should be run, with a sort of church at its center, and sort of dominating everything. And so they were hoping to make themselves a kind of beacon, I suppose, for reform within the wider Church of England. They created a system of church governance called Congregationalism. They disavowed any authority of Anglican bishops and placed the control of each congregation in the hands of the male saints, so the male members of each group or each church. Although they were supposedly independent, the clergy still asserted their powers, as they feared, sort of collectively, as they feared complete independence would undermine Puritan unity. And so they developed a set of official practices, which became known as the New England Way, in order to strengthen their authority. Membership requirements differed from English Puritans. Only saints could take communion and baptize their children in New England, but all adults were expected to attend services as well as pay tithes. Education also ensured orthodoxy was carried on to the next generation, as all were required to be familiar with the Bible and so had to be literate. So you see a much higher rate of literacy in New England than you see in other parts of the colonies. In order to ensure a supply of trained ministers, they also founded a university. Harvard was founded in 1636 with the main aim of training Puritan ministers. They agreed that the church had to be free of state control, and so opposed any idea of a theocracy. However, they did insist on cooperation between the government, the state government, and the church, which they refer to as a holy commonwealth. They obliged all adults to attend services and to pay tithes. Some Puritans, however, dissented from this orthodoxy. Roger Williams quite famously dissented, and he insisted that civil government should remain absolutely uninvolved with religious matters, which was sort of the antithesis of what they were attempting to do in Boston, and so he was banished. Quite often, Roger Williams gets glorified as someone who first proposed the idea of separation of church and state, and you'll get lots of appreciation going his way, which is probably a little bit unfounded. It wasn't necessarily that he wanted to protect the free government of the state from church interference, but rather it was the other way around. He wanted to protect his idea of the pure church from the corrupt state government, and so wanted to keep them completely separated. And this was an idea that Winthrop, in his sort of holy experiment, the idea of community being perfectly aligned with the church, he didn't go for it. So therefore, Roger Williams is banished as a result. And Hutcheson was another sort of dissenter who sort of felt, in a way, she was kind of a Protestant purist, if you like, even more so than the Puritans themselves. She reiterated that the Puritan belief in good works was a false road to salvation, probably insisting that it was a little too Catholic. Since God had predetermined who would be saved, she also defied the acceptance of gender norms by criticizing the clergy. And for that dissent, she also was banished. Williams eventually goes on to found the colony of Rhode Island, and Hutcheson meets an untimely death, I believe, in the colony of New York, which is unfortunate for her. In order to preserve the sort of New England way of life, the Puritans evolved their political and religious institutions to be far more democratic than those that you would see in England itself. They provided for the establishment of towns to distribute the land. And the legislature authorized a town by awarding a grant to landowners who would lay out the settlement, organize the church, and then distribute the land and establish a town meeting. County courts were the courts of law, and the town meeting conducted any kind of local administration. Even the landholding system encouraged community. Families lived near one another, separated from their farm acreage, as you can make out in the map there. So you would have your town where all the houses would be lined up, and then the actual farms were out. And so people would have to travel to their farmland in order to work it, but they would always come back into the town, and so it encouraged the sense of community that you don't see in places like the Chesapeake colonies, where everyone lived on their acreage, and so you would be miles away from your nearest neighbor, and therefore not too inclined towards community. They also created a community of women. Women themselves were sort of a social force in the communities, and they created a community of them, of each other, of other women, in each town that helped to enforce the sort of moral standards, as well as to protect the poor and the vulnerable in each community. They defined matrimony as a contract rather than a religious sacrament, and JPs, Justices of the Peace, performed the weddings rather than the ministers. Divorces, although still infrequent, were possible, at least for those considered to be extremely wronged spouses. Although wives enjoyed a fair amount of legal protection against spousal violence and non-support, they suffered the legal disabilities of common law, of English common law. They had no property rights or any kind of rights independent of those of their husband. In New England, they also benefited from, as I mentioned before, a very benign disease environment. Most families owned farms that were able to meet their nutritional needs, and improved resistance also helped lower the death rates. Consequently, they lived longer and had larger families than you would see in the Chesapeake colonies. So most New England families grew enough to feed their families, but very few became wealthy from farming. Most who sought a fortune turned to lumbering or fur trading or shipbuilding or rum distilling or any other kind of major industry, really. As New Englanders grew more worldly, their values began to shift a little bit. Self-interest was the most fundamental threat to the ideal of a close-knit community that Winthrop had tried to build in Massachusetts. He believed that there were limits to legislative commercial behavior, and government leaders tried to regulate prices in order to protect consumers. Controversy between the clergy and the rural elite on one hand and merchants on the other hand proved to be a fight sort of for the soul of New England. The merchants made up the majority of the dissenters, and followers advocated a less strict version of Calvinism, so kind of toning down the religious aspect of the colony. After 1660, farmers who were hoping to expand their agricultural output voted themselves larger amounts of land and insisted on consolidating their current plots. So you also see at this time farmers moving out and building their houses on their land rather than in communities. So you start to see the breakup of that kind of New England village. As New England prospered, England itself was falling into chaos that was the Civil War. After the restoration of Charles II, following a sort of brief period where Oliver Cromwell was in charge, the monarchy sought to kind of undermine Puritan rule, as it was, in fact, the Puritans who had fought against the monarchy in the Civil War. So, of course, the restored monarchy is going to be less friendly to the Puritans following that. Erosion of the social vision in New England was also accompanied by a decline of the religious vision. Children from the first generation of Puritans not joining congregations, and because ministers only baptized the children of saints, you're starting to add generations of people who had no real connection to the Puritan church. So say, for instance, that for whatever reason, I and my fictitious husband are deemed to not be saints, not full members of the church. And then we have a child, so we're not baptized into the church. We have a child. Our child can't be baptized into the church either. And so we just kind of let it fall by the wayside. So now you have a second generation, which is my child, who is not baptized in the church and who is not particularly interested in church affairs or church teachings or anything. And then let's say my child has a child who is also unbaptized and even more disinterested in the church. And so you have a growing population of people now who have no connection or feel no real affinity for the church. And so this was something of a crisis for the clergy, and they came up with something of a solution, which became known as the Halfway Covenant. This permitted the children of all baptized members to be baptized, so that would be me, but left them only halfway members who could not take communion nor vote in church affairs. And it basically signaled the end of the rather pure New England way of dealing with the society. After this, the influence of the Puritan church erodes pretty rapidly in Massachusetts Bay area, so that it's no longer really a defining force in relations as far as that's concerned. New England was one of the first colonies that met with little resistance from the natives, at least at first, and at least partly because of the reduced population of Native Americans. The Puritans attempted to convert the Native Americans to Christianity with some limited success. In 1633, Massachusetts settlers began moving into the Connecticut River Valley, and so organized a new colony there in 1635. And friction between the Pequot, who were the native tribe living in the Connecticut River Valley, began to develop quite rapidly into open violence. Massachusetts and Connecticut took a concerted military action in 1637, beginning what became known as the Pequot War, and waged a rather ruthless campaign with other native allies. Their allies objected to the brutal tactics of the Europeans, and by 1637, resistance from the Pequot was completely crushed, and their lands were taken over and awarded to the new colony of Connecticut. As the colonies grew, the numbers and conditions of the natives declined drastically. Settlers brought new diseases that would strike the community, and intercultural trade, initially benefited both sides, but as the tribes began hunting for commercial benefit, the numbers of fur-bearing animals dwindled. which made it increasingly difficult to actually do so. English traders advanced goods on credit, which forced quite a lot of natives into debt, and the traders began taking on land as collateral, and so they were losing territory in that exchange as well. Anglo native conflict became rather acute during the 1670s due to pressures imposed on unwilling natives to sell more land or accept missionaries and legal authority of colonial government. King Philip's War, ignited in 1675 when the Plymouth colony hanged 3 Wampanoag for killing a Christian native and threatened to arrest their leader, who was known as King Philip. After crushing that uprising, the English sold hundreds of captives to the West Indies as slaves, so relations souring rather quickly in New England with the Native Americans. In 1691, you have one of the more notable incidents in New England history when several girls from Salem Village asked a local enslaved woman, who was named Tituba, to tell their fortunes and tell them about sorcery. Later, they began acting oddly, and the villagers believed them to be bewitched. The girls were asked to name their tormentors, and they identified 2 local white women, as well as Tituba. None of this was particularly unusual. However, fear of witchcraft was predominant in Europe at this time and extended to its colonies in the same way. Witches usually took the form of women whose pride, envy, discontent, and or greed led them to sign a pact with the devil, and more often than not also displayed some kind of unfeminine behavior like independence or being opinionated and things like that. Normally, accusations were only against one person, and they never generally went to trial. But Salem was different, as these accusations led to a colony-wide panic. The next year, in 1692, the girls identified 2 more rather prominent women in the village, and even a former minister. And very soon, fear took hold and overrode any doubt as to the girls' credibility. The judges ignored the normal procedure, and the jail soon overflowed with over 300 people who were accused of being witches. The pattern of hysteria, however, reflected the internal divisions in the community, as the map would show. Accusations tended to originate on the poorer western section and were directed at the wealthier eastern section, or Salem town. About 2/3 of the accusers were young women between the ages of 11 and 20, and most had lost at least one parent during the Anglo-Indian conflicts and were now household servants. They gained power through voicing the anxiety of others in the community. The accused were more often middle-aged wives and widows, many of whom inherited or at least stood to inherit more than the usual 1/3 of the estate. In other words, they might very soon have more economic power and independence than a lot of men, and that made them dangerous. The accused multiplied as those who were found guilty tried to save themselves by implicating others, and it got so bad that in late 1692, a sort of congregation of Massachusetts ministers began to doubt that any justice was actually being done in this act. The governor forbade any further imprisonments, and the ministers backed him in that decision in October, and soon after, all trials were suspended. By 1693, the governor had pardoned all those who were convicted or currently standing accused. However, a good 20 people were executed as witches, with one gentleman being crushed to death as a warlock. The witchcraft hysteria ended anything that might have been left of Puritan New England following that. Between 1630 and 1642, more than twice as many British immigrants went to the Caribbean as went to New England or elsewhere in North America. In the 1640s, sugar was introduced, and it became exceptionally profitable, but it also required a substantial amount of capital investment as well as a very large labor force to produce it profitably. Sugar production made the Caribbean colonies the wealthiest and the most productive during the 17th century. They managed to develop a very wealthy and powerful landholding elite as a result of the success of sugar, and the English imposed slavery on both blacks as well as Native Americans. And by 1670, the Sugar Revolution had transformed the British West Indies into a predominantly black and predominantly unfree society. West Indian slaves suffered severely from ill treatment and overwork on the sugar plantations, and after 1670, many islanders began to move to Carolina, and that facilitated the spread of large-scale plantation slavery in North America. The declining demand for white labor also diverted the flow of English immigration from the islands to the mainland. In Carolina, it was the first of the Restoration colonies, meaning that it was actually chartered by Charles II in 1663. The government was based on the fundamental constitutions, as they were known, and provided for a nobility that would hold 2/5 of all land and control the upper house of the legislature and judiciary. Ordinary citizens were expected to defer to that elite, but they could enjoy religious toleration, English common law, and elect an assembly, and offered a head right in order to get people to come to the colony. Up until the 1680s, however, most settlers were small landowners who didn't produce enough tobacco, lumber, or pitch in order to warrant maintaining a lot of slaves. Southern Carolinians, particularly those coming from Barbados, sought some kind of staple crop that would make them rich. By the early 18th century, rice was hit upon as that staple crop. It was introduced by slaves from Africa and almost overnight remade Southern Carolina into a society that resembled that of the West Indies, except that sugar was substituted for rice. White indentured servants didn't survive very well in the humid rice paddies filled with malaria-bearing mosquitoes, so the planter's solution was to import an ever-growing number of African slaves who had particular immunities against malaria. West Africans had developed immunities to both malaria and yellow fever, making them far more ideal to work in the conditions of the rice paddies. And so the demand for black labor rose proportionately. Enslavement was not confined only to Africans. However, Native Americans were also taken as slaves. However, they were a lot less durable. Once local supplies were exhausted, local supplies of Native Americans, that is, were exhausted, they would bring people in from far-off Spanish colonies or the interior plains or from Florida to the south. Between 30,000 and 50,000 Native Americans were actually brought in as slaves between 1670 and 1715 in the Southern Carolinas. Between the Chesapeake colonies and the New England colonies, you had another sort of group, which became known as the Middle Colonies for obvious reasons. These differed from the other three English mainland regions. They had much more ethnic as well as religious diversity, a much more diverse population. The land here was extremely fertile, and you also see much more dynamic urban centers popping up in the Middle Colonies. New Netherland was the first multi-ethnic colony. It was established by the Dutch, but only about half, maybe, of the colonists were actually Dutch. The rest of them were some mixture of German, French, English, Scandinavian, and African. There were at least 18 different languages spoken in New Netherland, and by 1643, the population included Protestants and Catholics, but also a fair number of Jews and Muslims. Trade was nominally controlled by the Dutch West India Company, but private individuals made money from illegally trading with natives as well. The Dutch allied successfully with the inland Iroquois, but relations with the coastal tribes soured, mirroring the kind of relations that the English experienced with the native population. All-out war eventually broke out in 1643 when the governor ordered the massacre of a previously friendly tribe protesting settler encroachments. In 1638, Sweden also planted a colony in the lower Delaware Valley, and that like New Netherland was also extremely diverse. Also like New Netherland, they depended very largely on fur trading with the local tribes. The Dutch saw the Swedes as interlopers and so launched an attack against them in 1655, overwhelming the Swedes, and they, as a result, peacefully accepted Dutch annexation. So New Sweden was relatively short-lived as a colony. Both of these colonies, however, were relatively short-lived generally, but significant in both their prosperity as well as ethnic and religious diversity. New York and New Jersey, as they come to be known as English colonies, were also intended as proprietary colonies with hierarchical societies, but again, like previous attempts, these plans also met with very limited success. In 1664, part of a broader war against the Dutch was going, or as part of a broader war against the Dutch, Charles II sent a force to conquer New Netherland. And appointed his brother, who was at that time the Duke of York, to lead the charge. After a peaceful surrender, New Amsterdam was turned over, and most of the settlers remained there. And as the proprietor of it, the Duke of York very humbly named the colony after himself, so it would become New York. Governors rewarded the wealthiest political supporters with large land grants in the colony, and they managed to set up manors along the Hudson River Valley, forming a landed elite. Ambitious plans ultimately collided with reality. In nearby New Jersey, the Duke of York awarded this territory to proprietors, but they had some difficulty controlling their province, and they eventually sold it to a group of Quakers who split it into West Jersey and East Jersey. Both governments collapsed in 1698. In 1701, they recombined to become New Jersey, the royal colony. Probably the most successful and most interesting of the middle colonies was Pennsylvania. In 1681, Charles II, in order to pay off a debt to a supporter, he gave his son, William Penn, the territory of what became known as Pennsylvania. Penn had two aims in establishing a colony in Pennsylvania. The first of these was to conduct a sort of holy experiment. Penn was a Quaker, and he wanted to establish a community based on Quaker teachings. His second goal, and this was also, of course, to make money off of the venture. The Quakers were sort of on the fringes of respectability in English society. They appealed very strongly to those on the sort of bottom rungs of the economic ladder, and at its core, it was based on the idea that the Holy Spirit, or the inner light, could inspire every soul. The mainstream believed that all were basically sinful unless they were saved, so the Quakers are much more optimistic in that regard. They trusted direct inspiration and disavowed any need for clergy. The Quakers' emphasis on individualism and equality also extended to social and political areas, too. They insisted that people deserved recognition for spiritual state, or for their spiritual state, rather, than worldly wealth, and refused to tip their hats to their social betters or any other sort of marks of deference that were expected in society. They also defied state authority by wearing hats in courts, refusing to bear arms. They treated women much more equally, as they believed that the inner light could speak to women just as well as it could to any men. And because of their dissenting opinions, they were often persecuted. Very careful planning gave Pennsylvania the most successful beginning of any European colony in the Americas. Penn sent an advance party in 1681 before arriving the next year with his settlers. He chose a site for the capital and principal port, naming it Philadelphia. In 1687, there were nearly 8,000 settlers who had arrived of all faiths and nationalities, with most arriving in families, so the population grew rapidly as a result. The government was made up of a very strong executive branch, the governor and council, and an elected assembly with limited powers. Pennsylvania avoided any early hostilities with the natives, partially because of their diminished numbers, but also because of sort of Penn's Quaker tolerance, which enabled him to treat with them on a much more level playing field, you could say. Land was key to its early prosperity. The land was very rich in Pennsylvania, and level lands enabled settlers to produce bumper crops, which were then exported to places like the West Indies. And so they became sort of the go-to place, kind of a breadbasket, and Philadelphia became a major commercial center. His peaceable kingdom, however, soon started to crumble and meet with resistance. In 1684, an opposition party attacked his efforts to monopolize foreign trade, and the bitter struggle that ensued deadlocked the government of Pennsylvania. The strongest opposition came in the lower counties, which eventually split off to form their own colony and became known as Delaware. Unlike in the English colonies, which we've just discussed at some length, which were very compact and densely populated, colonies for France and Spain were more far-flung networks of sort of fortified trading posts than anything else. A privately held company initially assumed responsibility for settling New France. They granted large tracts of lands to landowners who either imported indentured servants or rented out small tracts to farmers, but the harsh winters and short growing seasons limited their numbers. More successful were the commercial traders who obtained furs from the native tribes. In 1670, about 1/5 were independent traders living in native villages and often taking native wives in order to help their own commercial interests. They observed traditional norms of reciprocity and exchanges sealed bonds of friendships and alliance. Catholic missionaries also helped to shape French relations with the natives and followed the fur trade. Although they often feuded with traders, both groups served to extend French interest throughout the colonies. Louis XIV's chief minister was a very forceful proponent of the sort of new economic idea of mercantilism. Colonies should provide home countries with raw materials for manufacturing and markets for manufactured goods was the basic tenet of mercantilism. But in order to realize these mercantilist goals, New France had to first be made into a royal colony, which was done in 1663. They sought to stifle the Iroquois threat and sent 1,500 troops in 1666, which alarmed the Iroquois and essentially maneuvered them into making peace, which served to expand the fur trade further. This encouraged the French to try and push immigration, so that within a decade the population rose from about 2,500 to about 8,500. However, most of those were indentured servants and former soldiers and officers. Immigration petered out quite quickly, however. By 1673, about 2/3 of those immigrants had actually come back to France. So France having much more difficulties in getting people to stay in their colonies. The fear of expansion from England and Spain led France to attempt to dominate the North American heartland. In 1672, Louis Joliet and Jacques Marquette became the first Europeans to reach the upper Mississippi. A decade later, Robert Cavalier de La Salle traversed the entire Mississippi all the way to the Gulf of Mexico and claimed it all for France, naming it Louisiana after the king. In 1698, the first colonists began to arrive on the Gulf Coast and erected a fort near what is now Biloxi, Mississippi. And in 1702, they founded a trading post, which is now Mobile. But growth in New France pretty much stagnated after that, never really able to get that off the ground. The northernmost outposts of Spain's empire, New Mexico and Florida, remained rather small and weak all throughout the 17th century. They needed ties with friendly natives in order to obtain land, labor, and security, but Spanish policies weren't particularly conducive to friendly relations. They sought to rule New Mexico by subordinating the Pueblo. Missionaries oversaw their spiritual lives by establishing churches and forcing conversion. Landowners were awarded encomiendas, which exploited native labor for personal profit. And all of this served to drive a wedge between the Pueblo and their non-farming neighbors by collecting corn as tribute. The Pueblo could no longer trade their surplus with their neighbors, which prompted them to raid the Pueblo, and so ignited conflict there, where it previously didn't exist. The Pueblo initially accepted Spanish rule and tried to kind of reconcile Catholicism with their own customary beliefs. However, prolonged drought started to strike in the 1660s and served to decimate the Pueblo population. In response, the Christian Pueblo revived some native practices, hoping to restore the spiritual balance. Missionaries who sought to repress the revival raided the sacred kivas and destroyed religious objects and publicly whipped any religious leaders and their followers. By 1675, the matters came to a head when the governor sent soldiers to sack the kivas and to arrest religious leaders, with 3 of them being sentenced to death, and a 4th actually hanging himself while in jail. The followers of the leaders were jailed themselves, whipped, and then sold as slaves. This led to armed Pueblo warriors converging on Santa Fe and demanding the prisoners' release, and the governor was forced to comply with these demands. Pueblo resentment continued to grow with the leaders, both Christian and traditional, meeting in secret to plot the overthrow of the Spanish. On August 10, 1680, the Pueblo and their allies attacked the homes of 70 colonists and killing all but 2 of them. They then moved south, enacting a massive siege against Santa Fe, which began what became known as the Pueblo Revolt. 400 colonists were killed, and after the siege, the remaining colonists fled to El Paso and beyond. By 1692, a new governor arrived to reconquer New Mexico, exploiting the divisions that had started to form among the Pueblo themselves, and used violence and threats in order to reestablish Spanish rule. Resistance continued until 1700, but the Spanish needed the Pueblo in order to help defend against the Apache, who were now attacking on horses, left behind by the original colonists. They, in a sort of move to compromise, abolished encomienda in order to appease the Pueblo and allowed the practice of their traditional religions so that things could move forward a little bit easier. For most of the 17th century, the population in Florida consisted mostly of Spanish soldiers and missionaries. They did face periodic rebellions from native tribes protesting forced labor and religious conformity. However, native tribes from northern English colonies raided villages in Florida and captured local tribesmen to sell to the English as slaves. In order to counter the French, Spanish authorities also proclaimed the province of Texas in 1691, but no real settlements were made until 1716. And that's pretty much where the story leaves off for now. As we move into chapter 4, we'll talk a little bit more about the English colonies and so the personalities of the English colonies. And we'll also talk about why the English colonies diverged so sharply from England itself, so much so that a war broke out between the two.